Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Michelle McDonald. I am the director of the Library and Museum here at the American Philosophical Society, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's lunch at the library. Before we get started, it is an APS tradition to acknowledge where we are and what came before us. Toward that end, the American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the past, present, and ongoing homeland of the Lenape people. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance, and expresses its sincere thanks for the past and the ongoing generosity of numerous indigenous communities and individuals who have offered their guidance, their expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. Thank you. So, the American Philosophical Society. The American Philosophical Society was founded in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin and many others as America's first learned society. It was a place where scientists and thinkers could come together to consider how best to advance the project of the colonies. And I usually start with this quote because I find it interesting that in 1743, Franklin and the other founders thought that the first drudgery of settling the colonies, which confines the attention of people to mere necessaries, is now pretty well over. So Franklin was a smart man, but perhaps future seeing might have had a few issues down the line he hadn't yet accounted for. Nonetheless, the APS was founded, and we have ever since been a place for the promotion of useful knowledge. We do so in a variety of ways. We have a membership, an elected membership, which come to us because of significant contributions in their respective field, about 1,000 members strong at the moment. 2 meetings a year of these members are held, predominantly in Philadelphia, although this fall we will be experimenting with a member meeting in San Diego. We also have a historic archive and museum. We have dozens of special events, dozens and dozens, 130 public events last year. We have the APS Press, which is North America's longest continuous operating press, and we have research grants, over 300 each year, that support not only work here at the American Philosophical Society, but send researchers to the farthest corners of the globe to conduct cutting-edge scientific inquiry. For those of you, has anyone here used the APS library, the archive? A few. Raise your hands. Raise your proud hands. Proud hands. The APS collection has about 14 million manuscript pages, as well as over 320,000 volumes, many of them rare. Among our collections are the papers of 7 Nobel laureates, with an 8th, I have been told, on the way, as well as a host of increasingly digital or born digital materials, and over 3,300 museum objects. All of this work is coordinated through a variety of scholarly centers which reflect our collecting foci. We have 4. We have early American history, we have the history of science, we have Native American and Indigenous history, and then, of course, our material culture collections. And undergirding all of their work is our Center for Digital Scholarship, which helps to make this material as accessible and as relatable as we can to a variety of audiences. You might be asking yourself how we do all of this, and the answer is through friends like you. So many of you are already friends of the American Philosophical Society, but if you are not a friend yet, I do encourage you to consider becoming a friend. And before I actually begin the formal introduction, one last promotional announcement. How many of you have been to this year's exhibition? How many of you would like to come to this year's exhibition? That's a better response. Philadelphia, the revolutionary city, opened in mid-April, and within the first 6 weeks, we had over 25,000 visitors. It is proving to be the most popular exhibition that we have had since before COVID. We anticipate that we will set a record for attendance this year. It is a fantastic collection that looks at the impact of war on Philadelphia and uses not only our collection, but collections from a number of nearby repositories to tell these stories. It is free, it is open to the public Thursday through Sunday through December 28th. So please do set your calendar. And now, without further ado. Peter Conn, who is this afternoon's speaker, retired from the University of Pennsylvania as the Vartan Gregorian Professor of English and Professor of Education, and was a member of the graduate groups in the history of art and American civilization. His publications include The Divided Mind, Ideology and Imagination in America, 1898 to 1917, Literature in America, and The American 1930s, A Literary History. His book, Pearl S. Buck, A Cultural Biography, was chosen as a New York Times notable book. Conn also wrote and presented a video course and book on American bestsellers for the Teaching Company and has given talks at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, the Whitney Museum, the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I am enjoying the musical interlude. The Philadelphia Museum of Art and other institutions on a number of American artists. He is a John Simon Guggenheim Fellow, and he has received several awards for distinguished teaching. He has served as a literary consultant on numerous television projects, including the Emmy Award-winning series, The American Short Story, adaptations by novels by James Baldwin and Saul Bellow, and a video biography of John Dos Passos. Since 1993, Conn has served as a visiting professor at the University of Nanjing in the People's Republic of China. And in 2011, and again in 2013, was sponsored by the Ford Foundation. This afternoon, we have the privilege of learning more about Peter Conn's most recent book, published by our own APS Press, Thomas Sully's Philadelphians, Painting the Athens of America. Please join me in warmly welcoming Peter to the stage.
Thank you to APS for inviting me. Thank you for those who have joined us. I need to begin with a clarification. In spite of the conclusion you might draw by the arrangement of this cover, that is not me on the cover, nor was it ever me. He was a handsome man. A word about our proceedings. You have found at your place, or were given, a little handout which does reproduce the cover, and then the table of contents. And the reason for that is that in the time available, you'll see that there's quite a few chapters in there covering quite a few separate topics. In the course of our time together, I will only really have time to talk about 3 of those chapters in some detail. And at least you'll have a sense of what else is going on in the book. I start with this image, and this is the only image you will see that was not painted from the life, since Franklin was dead about a decade before Sully moved to Philadelphia, and I'll get back to Sully's biography in a moment. But I start with this for a couple of reasons. One, as an early demonstration of Sully's extraordinary skill. If I did not tell you that this was oil on canvas, I imagine that you would assume it was a 3-dimensional bas-relief cameo. It is, in the flesh, about that size. It's a very large painting. And it was gifted to the Franklin Institute in 1824 when the Franklin Institute had opened. It was a gift from Sully. Enjoy it here, and also in the much reduced version in my book, because you will never see it again, because it's now in storage at the Franklin Institute. The other reason I start with this image is that Franklin is the author of my subtitle, Painting the Athens of America. Many of you, particularly in this room, are familiar with that phrase, And many of you who are familiar with the phrase are familiar with the fact that it is attributed to Gilbert Stuart. In fact, it was Franklin's phrase. And although Gilbert Stuart is identified as the author of the phrase by Google, even by Google assisted by AI, that's wrong. Franklin in 1731, he's still a young man, writes to the colonial governor asking for help in promoting his first project, the library company, and says to the colonial governor, with your help, we will make this into the Athens of America. It was aspirational. It wasn't descriptive. And Franklin, of course, more than anybody, in fact, more than anybody else's, helped to make Philadelphia, at least demonstrably, the Athens of Philadelphia. But now we turn to Sully himself. There's the image uncluttered by me or other lettering. Sully was born in England in 1783. He would live to be almost 90, dying in 1872. He was born to a theatrical family which moved when he was about 9 years old to the, what was that, I guess, the United States, certainly no longer the colony. First to Richmond, where a relative of the Sully family had a theater. And so all the Sullys were, and Sully at a very young age was on stage. The family then perambulated around, and to cut to the chase, Sully and what was then his already growing family settled in Philadelphia in about 1806 and 1807 and lived here for the next 60-some years. He made forays out of Philadelphia for painting commissions. As he became more and more prominent, he was called to the Hermitage to paint Jackson, to Monticello to paint Jefferson. He also painted Monroe, painted John Quincy Adams. So he was early and widely celebrated. In the course of his career, most all of it in Philadelphia, he painted 2,000 portraits. That's a number I'll come back to because it's a fairly impressive number, along with 500 paintings of other categories, but he was a portraitist. There is some evidence that Sully would actually have preferred to have been a historical painter. In Europe, history paintings conferred the highest prestige, and they also earned the highest prices. And Sully, as I learned more and more as I went through the materials that I could locate about his practice, Sully always had his eye on the bottom line. He had a large and continually growing family. He wound up with 9 children to support. And so eventually he traded in his preference for history painting to become one of America's finest portrait painters. He was persuaded by American taste in that early national period. In 1805, Aaron Burr wrote, Aaron Burr wrote to the painter John Vanderlyn, then in Paris, advising Vanderlyn to come home from Paris because, quote, if you are to send in some portrait painting, this is the best country, for here is the rage for portraits. 2 years later, Salmagundi, a humor magazine, reported, quote, everyone is anxious to see his face on canvas, however stupid and ugly it may be, end quote. And the painter John Neal wrote that portraits, quote, abounded in our country. You can hardly open the door of the best room anywhere without surprising or being surprised by a picture of somebody plastered to the wall and staring at you with both eyes and a bunch of flowers. So Sully got the message. Let's talk very, very briefly about the Philadelphia in which Sully settled in the very early part of the 19th century. From its first founding, or at least from its first founding by white Englishmen, this was a city whose prosperity, and it was considerable, was based on trade. And that would continue to be true through the entire 18th and into the first years of the 19th century. We were sending out of our busiest port in the colonies, busier than New York, busier than Charleston or Baltimore, furs, timber, and a few manufactured products. We were importing a lot of finished products, sugar and molasses, and so on. Our ships were trading up and down the East Coast to visit all the colonies and going back and forth to London and Liverpool regularly. By 1840, Philadelphia ships were involved in the China trade. So it was a significant economic engine trade. After the national capital moved to Washington at the turn of the century, more or less, and finance began to move to New York. This is what some historians summarize as the money moved from Chestnut Street to Wall Street. But Philadelphia still remained the most cosmopolitan city in the country. The place that set the standards for early 19th century culture, natural history, art, architecture, theater, and science. And so the phrase attributed to Gilbert Stuart, but actually the brainchild of Benjamin Franklin, had some truth in it. It had become something like, in its architecture, in its painting, in its book publishing, in its learned societies, and the library company, the Athenaeum, and so on, something like the Athens of America. It was also a city of frequent and murderous violence, a subject to which we shall return. So the first of the three topics I'm going to discuss briefly is the theater. And of course, Philadelphia, to this day, is a theatrical center. But at least up until the beginning of the American Revolution, that is to say, through the third quarter of the 18th century, opposition to playgoing was strong, led mostly by Quakers. As the Puritans opposed the theater in Boston, the Quakers opposed the theater in Philadelphia. In 1759, to give you some examples of Quaker influence, in 1759, the House of Representatives of the colony passed a law, quote, forbidding the showing and acting of plays with a penalty of 500 pounds, which would have been a whole lot of money. The First Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia in 1774, passed a resolution denouncing, quote, every species of extravagance and dissipation, especially horse racing, all kinds of gaming, cockfighting, exhibition of shows, and to make the point, they repeat, plays, and other expensive diversions, end quote. Young Jacob Ehrensolar, who was the first apprentice at Pennsylvania Hospital, was accepted. His charter includes prohibitions against dice playing and fornication, but also that he was not to haunt alehouses, taverns, or playhouses. Things changed following the Revolution because for the next 8 years, George Washington was living in Philadelphia, and George Washington loved to go to the theater. So nothing was going to stand in the way of theater beginning to flourish in such playhouses as this. This is one of several Chestnut Street theaters that opened, that is to say, one would be built and burned down, and the next would be built and burned. This, I think, is the second one by Latrobe, but I'm not absolutely sure. In any case, Latrobe's theater and the one that came after it could seat 2,000 people. So these were not small venues. And as you can see, they were wonderful pieces of architecture with their columns and their decorations and so on. So plays were being put on, and they were being put on regularly, and they were being put on adequately. It could be, I deduced from a pattern I saw, it could be that moralistic suspicion continued, because in the advertisements of some of these plays, there would be a little moral tag attached. You went to see Hamlet for an example of filial piety, and you went to see Richard III to see the fate of tyranny. So what did Philadelphians in the early national period go to see? And we have actually quite a lot of material on this, both archival and published. 1/4 of all the plays put on in Philadelphia in those first few decades of the 19th century, surprise, open the envelope, Shakespeare. And among Shakespeare's plays, also not terribly surprising, Romeo and Juliet and Richard III. And here is a Richard III. We're talking about a man who was, in his time, the most celebrated actor, well, let me not overstate that, among the most celebrated English actors of his time. No longer that familiar, his name, and you've got a copy of it in the handout, George Frederick Cooke. Cooke began acting in London about the turn of the 19th century and had tremendous success in this part. Richard III was his specialty. He was enormously successful, but had a problem. He was a drunk. And so his performances would, I don't want to say regularly, but more often than not, or at least more often than seldom, the sign would go up, performance canceled, indisposition of the star. In 1810, he agreed to come to the United States to bring Richard III to us. And Philadelphia was astounded because at that point, Philadelphians, of course, understood that the whole American experiment was a cultural footnote to the great cultural colossus that was Europe. What I've been able to determine is that Cooke had become so estranged from his manager over these alcoholic episodes that he just decided, somebody walked up to him, some enterprising American manager, would you sign this? So he came. In any case, his coming to Philadelphia in 1810 was met with almost the kind of rapturous welcome that Dickens got when he showed up in Boston in 1842. His performances did not disappoint. I'll read you one critic's review. Theatrical criticism in the 19th century, especially early, is far more colorful, you'll hear a couple of examples, than it has become. His Richard was received with shouts. His death scene was truly appalling. As he lifted up his left arm over his forehead and gave the last withering look at Richmond, the expression of his eyes, as they for a moment vividly rolled, then became fixedly glazed, and all vision seemed gone, was peculiar and thrilled the audience. This is Sully's portrait of George Frederick Cooke. It was commissioned by a group of George Frederick Cooke fans, Philadelphia fans of George Frederick Cooke, who offered Sully $300. In his journals over time, periodically he will say, I'm still waiting for the $300. But in any case, this is not quite life-size. In fact, you're probably seeing this portrait here. I love this screen, by the way, the size of it. You're probably seeing this at about the size it actually is without its frame. This is located in the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, but like the Franklin cameo, you will not see it because it's in the basement. And many of you have been in the basement storage areas of museums, so you know that the paintings are put on little racks and they're pushed in between little cages and so on. And so I wanted to see this face to face, and it has never been on display for quite a few years. And the collections manager took me downstairs in order to see it. He was very kind. But when you pull it out, of course, because of its verticality, it's on its side. And neither he nor I was going to touch it in case we ruined something. So I spent 15 minutes lying on the concrete floor in order that I could look at George Frederick Cooke and look at this thing. I mean, every surface, from the tile floor to the leather boots to the silk and so on, and furry garments, and above all, that plume that is arching back from the top of his costume. That plume is pointing at a statue of a female saint. This is a man enjoying his villainy. The look on his face tells you that. He imported a few lines from Henry VI, Part 3. I can smile and murder as I smile, and wet my cheeks with artificial tears. This is Cooke doing this, without the hump, by the way. Cooke never used that terrible gadget that so many Richard III's have. It's a remarkable portrait, and it made Sully's reputation. He was 28 years old when he did this, and from then on, Sully was much in demand. The other actor we're going to look at is far better known to this day, Fanny Kemble. Fanny Kemble was a part of what was a famous London theatrical family. Charles was her father. And she debuted at age 19, I'll talk about that in a moment, and played on stage both in England and America for a grand total of 5 years. But in those 5 years, she established such success that to this day, she is well known as one of the finest actors of the 19th century. She had no interest in being on stage. Her father's Covent Garden Theatre was in financial trouble, and he begged her, having a sense, either having seen her do things at home or whatever, begged her to play Juliet. Please play Julie. She rehearsed for 3 weeks, and at 19 years old, she debuted. Quote, "The applause was tumultuous and rapturous. The large audience hailed this girl of 19 as the worthy successor to her incomparable aunt." That would be Sarah Siddons, one of the great actors of the 18th century. When she came to the States, the critics wrote such things as, "She stands unrivaled before the American public." One of the plays she starred in was one we no longer know much about, called Fazio, in which she plays a wronged and embittered wife. And when one of the critics went to see her in Fazio, I'll quote you just a part of his breathless review, "When she rose with the action of the play and began to display her power, when she gave to the fierce passions of the role the agonized threats of the half-maddened wife, the spectators were transported with enthusiasm and wept and applauded wildly." She must have been something to see. Well, in 1834, she gave up the stage to marry Pierce Butler. Butler had been following her around through her, at least New York, Philadelphia performances. She also performed in New York. And indeed, the term I think we would use today was stalking her. He would show up in her dressing room after many of her performances playing a flute and making nice. Well, he said he proposed marriage, and since she really wasn't all that interested in this spectacular career, and he had invited her to live with him at what he called his farm in Georgia, she married him. And so she became Mrs. Butler, which in many history books she remains to the day she died, although she gave it up. She divorced him not long thereafter because she went down and saw that it wasn't exactly a farm. It was a gigantic plantation being, of course, worked on by hundreds of enslaved people. She was instantaneously horrified. And not long thereafter, she left and went back to Philadelphia. Out of that experience, I'm going to go back and forth here for a minute. Out of that experience, she wrote a book called A Residence on a Georgia Plantation in 1838, 1839. But she didn't publish it. And she didn't publish it in 1838 or 1839. She published it in 1863, to which I'll come back. She didn't publish it, I learned by finding this in an archive. As early as 1835, okay, so before she had gone to Georgia, as early as 1835, Kemble had written an anti-slavery article while in Philadelphia. Writing from Philadelphia to a friend, she said she had not dared to publish it, quote, "lest our fellow citizens should tear our house down and make a bonfire of our furniture, a favorite mode of remonstrance in these parts with those who advocate the rights of the unhappy black people." And we're going to find out just how true that was. She did publish it in 1863, shortly after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And there is at least one entire scholarly book devoted to the impact that the scholar at least argues had something to do in England, where she was still a name. She hadn't played in England in decades. Where she was still a name, it had something to do with persuading England to stay out of an alliance with the Confederates, which, to the extent is true, is a remarkable achievement. Now, I'm told if I do this, we can go back to the portrait. This is Sully. He did about 20 portraits of her. This is considered to be the best. This is Fanny Kemble as Beatrice in Much Ado. And it's one of Sully's remarkable romantic, they're all romantic, or most of them are, portraits. looking back at you over her shoulder, emerging out of billows of silk and fabric, her hair nicely held in place by whatever that's called, which I don't know, across her head. Lovely, and in any case, looking at you with all sorts of confidence. The families, in fact, became quite friendly, and one of the reasons that he spent a great deal of time painting her. In 1837, Sully went to England with a commission from the Sons of St. George chapter in Philadelphia to paint Queen Victoria, who was the brand new Queen Victoria, even pre-coronation Queen Victoria. He brought this painting to London to show to the Queen's assistants and so on something of his skill. He got the commission to paint what was the first oil painting of Queen Victoria by anybody. And it's a spectacular painting, which I can't show because it has nothing to do with Philadelphia. But I wish I could. Oh, yeah. Now we go on to the next topic, the Jews of Philadelphia. I start with Alexis de Tocqueville. In 1831, as most of you know or knew, de Tocqueville came to the U.S. to study penitentiaries or prisons. He did do some of that, but when he went back to France, among other things he published was the most enduring and, in some respects, the most influential political science text about America that we have had. Never out of print, often quoted, seldom read, including by me, but I read at it, Democracy in America. And he says this, and I think it is the 17th chapter, that doesn't matter. Upon my arrival in the United States, the religious aspect of the country was the first thing that struck my attention. In France, I had almost always seen the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom pursuing opposite courses, diametrically opposed to each other. But in America, I found that they were intimately united and that they reigned in common over the country. For the Americans, the idea of Christianity and liberty are so completely mingled that it is almost impossible to get them to conceive of the one without the other. Well, a very great scholar named Naomi Cohen, some years ago, spent time going through the charters or constitutions of the colonies, provinces of America, including Pennsylvania, and discovered that in almost all of them, references to Christianity festooned these pages to Jesus, to the New Testament, to salvation, and how one of the purposes of politics in America was to support religion and therefore to disadvantage and often disenfranchise people who did not subscribe to a Christian religion. By Christian, of course, they did not mean Catholic. They meant Protestant Christianity. And since I've spent a lot of time studying Unitarianism, they didn't mean Unitarianism either. They meant mainline versions of Christianity. In the early national period, the possibility of harm to Jews here and elsewhere was enhanced by the fact that these were the years, as many of you know, of what's called the Second Great Awakening, burned over New York and so on. Whereas an upsurge of really energetic evangelical Christianity. But the Jews in Philadelphia, who remember were a tiny fraction of this population, a data point from a few years before the period we're talking about, 1775, this, by the way, is supposed to be the original Mikveh Israel, I think Third and Cherry. Anyway, 1775, in a population of 25,000, 300 were Jews. And they were seldom the victims of violence. The victims of violence were other, and we will get to some of that. They were often the victims of insult and discrimination. On the other hand, I can report from personal research, the Athenaeum, founded in 1814, had a number of Jewish shareholders from day one, and one or two Jewish members of their board from day one. I can also report that young Jewish men were being enrolled in what was then the College of Philadelphia, would become the University of Pennsylvania, as early as the 1760s. So, and Jews were active supporters of the theater, for example, by which I mean giving financial support. And among those Jews, the Gratzes were the preeminent family. And she's represented in my book, perhaps inevitably and justly, by Rebecca Gratz. She was born in 1781, and she was deeply committed to her Jewish faith from her childhood. She was also an eager participant in Philadelphia social life. She was noted for the wit of her conversation, for her sociability, and we'll see some examples of that as we look at a couple of portraits. Her conversation was reputed to be, quote, as one scholar said, lively and perceptive. She was an avid reader. She read Jewish devotional texts, but the Gratz household library also included Shakespeare, I'm not surprised, Hume's History of England, Milton's Paradise Lost, I'm a little more surprised about that. She read and approved of Walter Scott's Ivanhoe. And at least some of you in the room have heard the story that Rebecca of York in Ivanhoe was modeled on Rebecca Gratz. It is, alas, not true. But she liked the book and wrote to a sister-in-law, quote, I felt a little extra pleasure from Rebecca's being a Hebrew maiden. I feel gratitude for Scott's justification of the Jewish character. And some years ago, a British scholar wrote a history of the representation of Jewish characters in all of 19th century British fiction, and Rebecca of York is the capstone, not idealized, but humanized, and in no way stereotyped. Her significance lies in her philanthropy. She had resources, that cannot be denied, but she demonstrated extraordinary organizational, administrative, and, when necessary, fundraising skills. Half a dozen different organizations for the relief of widows, of orphan children, often focused on Jewish population, the small Jewish population, but often reaching out. This is one of two portraits of Rebecca Gratz, both in the Rosenbach, and they are very different, but each in its own way spectacular. Here she is, glowing, stylish, a lively woman, self-contained, undeterred by the designation spinster, captures something of her confidence. She's looking right at you. Tiny hint of a smile if she happens to approve of you. The second portrait that he made of Rebecca comes a little later. It's very different. Romantically cloudy background. Sully did a lot of that. Glistening dark hair, a splendid hat. I describe it as perhaps even provocatively heart-shaped. I don't know if I should have done that. She rises out of her very elegant costume and reminds us that earnest and hard-working as she was a social and sociable woman, a fine conversationalist. The third of the topics I'm going to discuss is the debate over slavery. And I'll come to that picture with which some of you are already familiar in the course of this. In the late 18th and early 19th century, Philadelphia was undoubtedly the city with the largest number of both free and enslaved black people. By about 1775, again, a little bit before our period, the number of free blacks in Philadelphia seems to have reached 250. The number of enslaved black people was 1,400. And we need to remember that, of course, this was the southernmost of the northern cities, and that attitudes towards slavery were sharply divided, and I'll be elaborating on that in a minute, in part because we were so close to the Confederate States, well, they weren't yet, the slave states, that families were being shared across those borders, and lots of trade. Cotton was coming from the South to Philadelphia and other northern cities. Opposition to slavery began early, and it began with the Quakers. As early as the 17th century, 1688, Francis Pastorius issued the first printed manifesto against slavery that we are aware of. Philadelphia became the place, again, perhaps because of its location and because of Quaker influence, in which the first formal abolition society was chartered, and that was in 1775. And a number of other abolitionist societies were founded over the next decades here. In 1780, the Commonwealth is quite proud of this. In 1780, Pennsylvania passed the first Emancipation or Abolition Act. What they usually, 1780 is pretty early in the game. What they usually don't tell you, it was called the Gradual Emancipation Act. And the emancipation of individuals was shackled to dozens of contingencies and so on. And the bottom line is that the last enslaved Philadelphian was emancipated in 1848. But abolition grew as a cause, and it was also the site of the first racially integrated abolition society in 1830, the Female Emancipation Society. The great historian Sean Wilentz says that by the 1830s, abolitionism became a genuine popular movement. However, as Wilentz also goes on to explain, it didn't mean that abolition was going to work. It didn't mean that the cause of abolition was going to succeed, because the fact itself of these public manifestations of opposition to slavery was so controversial that this is where the violence really begins to heat up, not just between the white folks in town who were for or against abolition, but especially violence against black people. And let me get specific about that. As competition, particularly for jobs in the hard times of the post-1819 and post-1832 recessions and depressions began, violence heated up. And to quote one of the scholars of this subject, at least 6 large-scale race riots targeted black people between 1829 and 1854. Thousands were injured and hundreds died. Now, a footnote. I should not want you to leave here without understanding that violence was dramatic and horrific, but it was not the only violence in Philadelphia in the antebellum years. The white Catholics and white Protestants would band together to terrorize black people, and then they would go around the corner and terrorize each other, so that attacks on Catholics, for example, had become part of our DNA. Workers, when they were unemployed because of some of these economic downturns, would turn on the homes and sometimes the factories or shops of their former employees. Sections of the city, we didn't have a police force to speak of, were simply governed by what you might call crowds of mafia guys who would simply do whatever it is they wanted. Violence was so endemic that it even sometimes engaged what you might call the less likely perpetrators, prosperous middle-class white men. In 1834, this is in a history of violence by the great Richard Hofstadter, in 1834, while Jackson is busy crushing the second bank of the United States, businessmen in jackets and ties who were either for or against the bank met in bloody combat on Chestnut Street and beat each other to pulps. A lot of violence in this town. The year 1838 saw a double assault on black rights. First, in 1838, the state government, the Commonwealth government, revised the Constitution and inserted the word white in front of the qualifications for citizenship. So with a stroke of the pen, black men were denied a right that they had had for 4 decades, often been intimidated, sometimes, etc., but they had the right to vote, and they just lost it one afternoon. And in that same year, Pennsylvania Hall, 6th and North 6th at about Arch, just about where the Constitution Center stands today. The Fortin family, one of the prosperous black families in town, together with a lot of other folks, had raised the money to build this very handsome edifice, you can see several stories high, as a central meeting place for abolition conferences and conventions. On the occasion of, I'm not sure it was the first meeting, but very shortly after it opened, after black and white, male and female abolitionists had entered the hall, the mob showed up and burned it to the ground. Nobody was killed, but the building was simply destroyed. And I'm going to come back to that particular episode in just a little while. So for black people in Philadelphia in the 1820s and especially the 30s, the arc of history was certainly not bending toward justice. Well, this story has, on the other hand, a hero. This is a man whose name you may or may not have heard of. This is William Henry Furness. He is the father, by the way, yes, he is the father of Frank Furness, the architect, and Horace Howard Furness, the Shakespeare scholar, and so on. Furness was Harvard Divinity School educated, came to Philadelphia and became the first minister of the First Unitarian Church in 1825 and served in that capacity for 50 years until 1875 and then continued as pastor emeritus. Lived a very long life, almost all of it here in Philadelphia. And he was the abolitionist priest. In 1872, William Still published The Underground Railroad, a book about that fat, copies of which are here and also at Historical Society. It remains the most significant source of information about the activities of that legendary anti-slavery enterprise. Still, who was the corresponding secretary of the society, in this book of his, wrote this: "Among the abolitionists of Pennsylvania, no man stands higher than Dr. Furness, and no anti-slavery minister enjoys more universal respect. For more than 30 years, he bore faithful witness for the black man, in season and out of season, contending for his rights. When others deserted the cause, he stayed firm. When associates in the ministry were silent, he spoke out." He was a man passionate, the saying was, to two men. The man of Galilee, he wrote frequently and often about Jesus, whom he regarded as the most splendid human being, not God, ever to have lived, and the man of Africa. Rebecca Gratz admired his ecumenical approach to his religion and often attended his sermons, and they became friends. She said, your kind of Christianity is not far from my kind of Judaism." He was also a lifelong friend of Emerson. They had been in grade school together. Emerson, of course, remained in New England. Furness had moved to Philadelphia. That meant that their conversation had to be epistolary, which is a great boon to scholars because it means if they had lived next door to each other, we just had conversations, but I got to sit in Penn's library and read in his handwriting Emerson's letters to Furness and Furness's letters to Emerson. Now we get to the point of all this. For the first 2 decades of his ministry, 20s into the first half of the 30s, Furness was moderate in his comments on slavery, as far as we can tell. We don't have all, or probably even most of his sermons. I think it was because it starts in 1839. I think it was because of that burning of Pennsylvania Hall, which he witnessed. As, by the way, I should have mentioned John Sartain, who did that image, witnessed, so it's not like third hand. In any case, I think enraged by that particular outrage, he begins to become more and more eloquent, more and more angry, more and more insistent on the abolition of slavery, the evils of slavery. And he was further incensed by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which you'll remember entitled just about anybody to go through just about any city or town in the North and grab anybody who happened to be black and drag them back to the South and sell them into slavery, whether it would have been horrible enough if they were former slaves, whether they ever had been or not. And we can all be very grateful that nothing like that could happen again in America, just going out and grabbing people. Furness was so enraged by this and by the unwillingness of the city officials to oppose it in any way that he preached regularly that he would do everything he could to oppose it, and he would stand in front of anybody who tried to enforce this law. Well, his vocal opposition led, I used to think this was just a story, it's true, President Buchanan called a cabinet meeting and asked the Attorney General if it would be possible to indict Furness for treason. It did not happen. This portrait by Sully in a private collection, and the owner was very generous to let me have a picture of it, is again Sully at his romantic best. Some of the same devices that you've seen before, the white the white shirt surrounded by the black clothing, the head arising out of a variety of cloudy backgrounds. I particularly enjoy the fact, since Furness was noted as being a nonstop conversationalist, about that hand. He's right in the middle of it. He was a bit of a mansplainer, but everybody enjoyed his conversation because it was so lively. Now, what I'm going to do to finish up, just show you a few more portraits without the surrounding context, and I'll just situate them in about 2 sentences of context. This is one of my favorites of Sully. This is at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and it is actually on the walls. This is Colonel Jonathan Williams, and in spite of the color of his uniform, he was Army. He was a grandnephew of Franklin and had served as one of Franklin's secretaries in Paris. He went on to an extraordinarily distinguished military career. He was appointed by Jefferson as the first commandant of West Point, and he was also appointed by Jefferson as the first commander of the Corps of Engineers. And so I'm very pleased to announce to at least one of you in this room, he was made, this engineer, a fellow of the American Philosophical Society. What I particularly like about this portrait, I think you can see it, is that one of his buttons is not buttoned because he's an old man and he no longer has to stand in front of somebody and be inspected. He's enjoying, and Sully doesn't seem to be flattering him much, he's enjoying his rather corpulent old age. The structure you see dimly in the background is one of his structures, Fort Williams, which was built during the War of 1812. So that's Jonathan Williams. The next, I love this one. This is at Princeton. This is a man who is no longer a household name, but could be described as the most important politician ever to have come from Philadelphia. This is George Mifflin Dallas, who rose to the office of vice president under Polk. This is Dallas at 18 as he graduated from Princeton summa cum laude, and it's a wonderful portrait in several respects. One, again, this is just a gadget of his, right? We're going to highlight the face by climbing up to it, pushing us up through that white shirt. But the good looks, which we know from later photographs, probably real, and at least in my reading of it, the kind of arrogance that he would indeed go on to show throughout his career. He never got the top prize, but he did get to be the VP. There's only one biography of Dallas. The author starts by saying somebody had to do it. And, you know, many books, many scholarly books or other books begin with a little inscription or an epigraph or something like that. What the author of this biography put as that intro anecdote, 2 brothers left home to seek their fortune. One went to sea, the other became vice president. Neither was ever heard from again. Okay. This and the next come, again very briefly, from Pennsylvania Hospital. This is another extraordinary, all right, I'll talk about it very briefly because for this slide, for some reason, not giving me everything I want. This is Samuel Coates, who was a longtime manager of the Pennsylvania Hospital in the early 19th century. It's a wonderful piece of work. Come over to the Pennsylvania Hospital where I give tours, and you'll see it face to face. It's almost life-size, and everything about it. Once again, I'm going back to that George Frederick Cook portrait. There's fabric, there's mahogany, there's leather, there's just about everything. He fools you into thinking that's a stack of papers, not just paint, the feather on the quill and so on. This was painted early, again, in Sully's career, and was gifted to Pennsylvania Hospital by Sully, which I always thought was an act of great generosity, but it was right by what used to be the front door, the main door, and one scholar has said, that wasn't an act of generosity, that was business. Everybody who came into Pennsylvania Hospital saw that and said, if I've got the money, I want one of those. This one I'll stop only briefly. This is actually a much more famous image because this is Benjamin Rush, And it's the image on the front of most of the 8 full-length biographies that have been written of Rush. And I'm not going to pause over it except to say it's dramatic in a different way, where Rush is neither looking at us, as Coates is, nor looking at what he's reading, but simply thinking. And finally, this one, APS, John Vaughan. The painting is here, or there, and Vaughan was a longtime librarian here. He gets a lot of credit for having organized what was an increasingly gigantic and miscellaneous collection. He made his money, he was an immigrant, he made his money as a wine merchant. He was Washington's wine merchant. And while Washington was in Philadelphia for those years, he would buy his wine only from Vaughan, and they would often taste the wine together. He is in this Sully portrait, once again, holding, quite appropriately, a big book, holding his place in his big book, and not looking at us, but once again, content to look across at, or to think about what he's thinking about. Thank you very much.
So this was a very popular event. It took us a little while to get started. We started at about 10 after, so we have time for just 1 or 2 questions.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Only 1 or 2.
Just 1 or 2, I'm afraid.
Make them easy.
Make them easy questions. Okay. She's coming behind you.
Who was Sully's favorite subject and why?
Who was Sully's favorite subject? His favorite subject was portraiture. Okay, 1 or 2 questions, but this answer could go on for days. When I said he did 2,000 portraits, that isn't speculative. He's the only artist I know who made a careful record of every portrait he painted, by date, by size, by who it was, and how much he charged. So there are maybe 20 different portraits of Washington, but those were commercial. There are 20 different portraits of Fanny Kemble. Those were personal. So his favorite, you know, it's hard to say. Portraiture was his subject. Anything else? Oh, that was quick.
Excuse me, for the theater, Cushman, could you talk to a little bit about Charlotte Cushman? You know.
Well, I could, yeah. By the way, she's in the book, but I didn't want to do 3 portraits for 1 chapter. Charlotte Cushman, again, a name that's not quite as well known as it once was widely regarded as perhaps the finest female actor, American-grown female actor of the 19th century. She became both famous and somewhat controversial because she featured frequently in what are called trouser roles. She played Romeo to her sister playing Juliet. She played other male parts. She was apparently a woman of astonishing emotional intensity. In the book, I quote some of the people that acted with her and went pale and shaky when they got into certain kinds of highly emotional encounters with her. And there is a Charlotte Cushman Society here in Philadelphia to this day. Fantastic actor. The portrait is also in the book, the Sully portrait. Somebody should ask me what kind of training did he have, because
that was part of my
that's
question.
an interesting question.
I wanted to ask a 2-part question. What
Yeah.
kind of training did he have?
Yeah.
And did anybody ever critique his paintings? Because I noticed that in 3 of them, the neck is too long. Maybe I'm wrong. But in the actress Kemble, Fanny Kemble?
Fanny Kemble.
And
You're
in
quite right.
Furnace and in Rebecca, those 3.
Well,
the implied neck seemed too long.
He's gotten a variety of criticism, which I talk about a little in the book, but it's not for those reasons, or that reason. As far as the training goes, he had almost none. He spent 2 weeks with Gilbert Stuart early in his career, and was also sent to England. He went twice. The second time was to paint Queen Victoria, but much earlier, local fans provided him with the money to go to England and visit with Benjamin West, the expat American whose style Sully wasn't interested in, but who was always hospitable to young American painters coming over. And that gave Sully the chance not to learn anything from West, but to go to see all the great European and English paintings that were, at that point, mostly in private collections. So he's self-taught, but he became an enormously skillful technician, not just a painter. He wrote, and it was published either in the year of his death or the year after, a little book called Hints to Young Painters. And it's all about choosing and sizing canvas. It's about stretching. It's about making your own oil paints with the various pigments and so on. It is very, very technical, and a friend of mine who is an artist and an art teacher says that he actually finds some of it to this day quite useful. There's very little of his personality in it, although in one footnote in Hints to Young Painters, he does make a remark along these lines. Stewart says the nose is the hard part. I said the mouth.
No, I'm afraid on that note, we have to bring this program to a conclusion, but please do join me in thanking Peter Conn for his time with us this afternoon. The other personalities that were not featured this afternoon, you can learn all about them at the back table.